Hello, welcome to Lecture 5 for the Computational Core of Social Cognition. And we're going to continue discussing Hauser-Chomsky and Fitch's article on the language faculty. And we're also going to get into Connor's article about dolphins. And one thing you may recall from the article by Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch is that they distinguished two different kinds of grammar. Actually, there are more than two kinds, but in the article they discussed two of them. They discussed two different kinds of grammar, finite state grammars and phrase structure grammars. Now, the basic idea behind that, the important idea, is that some types of grammar require more powerful computers to implement than do others. Some grammars place greater computational demands than do others. And it may be that certain types of grammar are possible for one species that are not possible for some other species because of different computational powers in the brain for those two species. It's possible, for example, that maybe only human beings are capable of recursive embedding. And so that makes it possible for us to have certain thoughts that other species are just not capable of having. Okay? Now, Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch are suggesting, as a testable hypothesis, that human language is a mental faculty with greater computational power than what is found in the minds of other species. And specifically, what they're saying is that recursion is uniquely human, or they're suggesting that as an hypothesis. Okay, now here's one way of understanding what they're getting at. A hypothetically possible grammar produces sequences of symbols with no hierarchical structure. In fact, intuitively, commonsensically, that's what people tend to think that a sentence is. Intuitively, you think that a sentence is just one word after another, or one morpheme after another, or one object of some kind after another object. In other words, you intuitively think of it as being flat. And in the case of at least some animal communication, it does look like it's flat. For example, when you teach sign language to a chimpanzee, the chimp may produce the following series of signs. Give orange, me, give, eat orange, me, eat orange, give me, eat orange, give me, you. Now, that sequence of signs, not in English but sign language, was signed by a chimpanzee known as Nim Chimpsky, who is no longer among us. Chimpsky was a chimpanzee who was able to acquire sign language in some sense, but there's no evidence here of hierarchical structure. There's no evidence of finding a phrase within a phrase. You only have one symbol following another. In other words, the structure appears to be flat. Now, that stands in contrast to sentences produced by the human language faculty, which evidently do have a hierarchical structure. And here you can see an illustration. Now, this is not, this is not the most theoretically up-to-date analysis of the sentence, John hit the ball, but that doesn't matter. It captures the important part, namely that, theoretically, a sentence in the human language has a hierarchical structure. You have the ball, which is a phrase, and that phrase is a constituent of a superordinate phrase, hit the ball, which is itself as a constituent of a superordinate phrase, John hit the ball, which also is a sentence. Now, we've encountered the notion of hierarchical structure before in discussing certain compound relational models. Now this should look familiar. This is hypothetically, this is the psychological structure of Mosé society for the Mosé in Burkina Faso, in which you have a communal sharing structure nested in a communal sharing structure nested in a superordinate communal sharing structure, and so on. However, this kind of tree, this kind of branching structure, is much more familiar from linguistics than it is social cognition. Using this sort of tree to represent how one imagines or thinks or conceives of a social structure is a relatively new thing. It's more familiar in linguistics. The idea here is that this is psychologically real, that when you think about a complex social structure, or when you use a sentence, that something tree-like is actually occupying your mind on some level, not consciously, but in some corner of your mind there's some tree-like structure, something recursive is going on. Now Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch are suggesting that the ability to form these tree-like structures is uniquely human, because the human brain has the computational power to form them, whereas hypothetically in other species you don't have that. The brain of a chimpanzee, for example, is not able to form such a hierarchical structure. The best it can handle is a flat structure, just a sequence of symbols. Now, of course, not everyone is going to agree with that, and the point of Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch's paper was to stimulate research. And what one is supposed to do is try to prove them wrong, try to falsify their claim. And if you can't do that, then it's some reason to think that they might be right. How would you go about proving them wrong? In other words, how would you try and close the gap between human beings and other species? There are two possible ways of doing it. One way is to show that other species actually do use hierarchical embedding, but we just haven't teased it out yet. We haven't figured out how to demonstrate that they do, but actually in their heads somewhere they actually are exhibiting recursion. The other alternative is to go in the other direction and say that human language is not really tree-like. Our sentences do not have hierarchical structure. Our sentences are actually flat. In other words, common sense is correct. A sentence is just a sequence of objects, what computer scientists call a string. There are some people who believe this. It's probably false, though, because there is interesting evidence that sentences in language, human language, they actually do have a hierarchical structure. And now we're going to discuss some of that evidence. Some of the evidence comes from what is known as grammatical movement. And by grammatical movement, I mean the transformation of a sentence into a different sentence by moving part of that sentence toward the front. Okay? So, for example, take the sentence, he had said, he had called. You can form this into a question by taking the auxiliary verb had and moving it to the front of the sentence. The result is, had he said he had called, right? Now you may wonder, what does this have to do with hierarchical structure? Just be patient. This does have something to do with hierarchical structure. Now, notice that there are restrictions on the auxiliary verb which can be moved. In the sentence, he had said he had called, there are two auxiliary verbs. In fact, it's the same verb occurring twice. The word had appears twice in the sentence. In forming a question, you can move one had, but you cannot move the other one. In this case, you can move the first had, but you cannot move the second one. If you try moving the second one instead, you get something ungrammatical. Had he had said he called. And the star at the front of that sentence indicates that it's ungrammatical. That's a convention in linguistics, to put a star next to ungrammatical phrases. Okay. Now, in a way, it's a little bit surprising that this is ungrammatical, because if you look at the, let me see, if you look at the last three words of the first sentence, he had called, well, that by itself is a sentence, he had called. And in that case, you can move the auxiliary verb had to the front of the sentence. Had he called? That's perfectly grammatical. So, when he had called is all by itself, it's all right to move the auxiliary verb had, and you get a question. But when the same sentence is embedded in a superordinate sentence, you can't move that verb. You can't move that auxiliary verb. Instead, you have to move the other one. So there's a restriction here on the movement of the auxiliary verb. The restriction is that you can only move the most superordinate verb, okay, as illustrated here. Okay. Now here is a tree structure for the sentence he had said that he had called. I put the word that in parentheses because pronouncing that word is optional. He had said he had called, he had said that he called. Presumably it's there psychologically whether it's pronounced or not. Okay, now here's the point. He had said he had called. The verb which you can move, the auxiliary verb which you're allowed to move, is the superordinate one. You see, you can move the superordinate had, and you get had he said he had called. But if you move the subordinate had, you get an ungrammatical structure. Had he had said he called. So the rule here, evidently, is that you can only move the most superordinate auxiliary verb, or whatever it is that you're moving. It doesn't have to be a verb necessarily. But the general principle is it has to be the most superordinate instance of the right kind of object. And what that means is that rules for grammatical movement are sensitive to structure. In other words, hierarchical structure. It's as though the system is searching for an appropriate word, and it starts on the most superordinate level and works its way down. And as soon as it finds an appropriate object, it stops searching. Once it finds an appropriate object, it stops. But the point is that it's searching a hierarchical structure. It's not searching a string. It's not searching a sequence of symbols. And this is one illustration of what I meant earlier when I spoke of computational power. Searching through a hierarchical structure to find the object to be moved is a procedure that not just any computer is capable of. In fact, even the production of a hierarchical structure in the first place is something that not just any computer is capable of. Okay. So this illustrates what I'm getting at when I talk about computational power. It requires extra computational power to construct a hierarchical structure, and it also requires a special procedure to search through that structure. Now, at this point, you might object. You might say, well, this doesn't necessarily mean that the sentence is a hierarchical structure. It could still be flat. I mean, after all, isn't the system also moving the first appropriate object in the sequence? So maybe all that really matters here is word order. That's the objection. So what we have here are two hypotheses. One hypothesis is that the system is moving the most superordinate object, the most superordinate appropriate object, in this case the word had. That would reflect hierarchical structure. Okay. The other hypothesis is that the system is moving the first had, which appears in the sequence. And this hypothesis is consistent with there being no hierarchical structure. Now, to test the two hypotheses, we have to force them into making contradictory predictions. Luckily, we can do that because word order and hierarchical structure do not always line up. Okay? In some cases, the superordinate verb comes first, but in other cases, it does not. So consider the following sentence. The dog who had dug there had left. Now, if we assume that sentences are flat, then the first appropriate verb in the sequence is the one that's going to move in question formation. And that would yield, had the dog who dug there had left. But that's not grammatical. And if you have any doubt about it, then compare that sentence to the third sentence, had the dog who had dug there left. Okay. So this refutes the hypothesis that the sentence is actually flat, and that rules of grammatical movement are simply sensitive to word order. It's not the first had that's being moved, it's the most superordinate had. Right? So this got cut off a little bit, but you can see enough of it to know what I'm talking about. Had dug there is, in this case, subordinate, even though it occurs in the middle of the sentence. It's a subordinate clause. So the search procedure doesn't go down that far. It finds the most superficial, the most superordinate had, and moves that one. Okay? Now there's a simpler bracketed representation of the sentence that appears below the picture. The dog had left, and embedded within that sentence is a subordinate clause, who had dug there. So apparently there's some kind of search system in the brain. It's looking for an appropriate word. It begins on the most superordinate level. It finds the word had, which in this case happens to be near the end of the sentence, but it's still superordinate, and it moves that to the front of the sentence. It ignores the subordinate clause. This sensitivity to structure is evidence that sentences have structure. In other words, that they are hierarchically organized, which is to say that human language is recursive. Now, the form of this sentence can be represented more abstractly as an AB, center embedded in another AB. You can think of AB as, in this case, representing subject and predicate. So you have a subject-predicate structure, center embedded in another subject-predicate structure. Now, when Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch tentatively suggest that only humans can grasp structures of that form, AB, center embedded within AB, what they're saying is that only humans are capable of recursive embedding. In other words, only the human mind represents hierarchically organized structures, such as sentences. Now, this hypothesis has been challenged by scientists looking for examples of mental recursion in other species, which is fine because the whole point of the article by Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch was to stimulate research. Now, Timothy Gentner and his colleagues, they discovered that European starlings can be trained to recognize the recursive pattern AABB. And basically what they did was they trained starlings to peck at a hole if they heard this pattern. Now the pattern can take different forms involving different sounds. So in fact, it's only the abstract pattern that is being tested for. So the task is not quite as trivial as it may seem. So you train the bird to recognize something in the form AABB, and when it hears that, it pecks. Okay. Now, Chomsky was not impressed by Gentner's results, and what he said is that the birds are probably just counting to 2. So the bird counts 2 A's, and then the bird waits and listens to see if an equal number of B's follows. And if it is an equal number of B's, then the bird pecks. And that's not really embedding. That's just counting to 2 and storing the number 2 in short-term memory. Now, as you know, Chomsky has claimed that counting requires recursion. However, it's only unbounded counting that requires recursion. Okay. There's no evidence of unbounded counting in birds, and people have looked for it. They've looked very hard for it. We know that birds can count to 2, right? But they do not seem to be capable of indefinite counting. In other words, there's no evidence here that the starling is utilizing a +1 operation recursively to generate an unbounded series of natural numbers. No evidence that the bird is doing anything recursive. Okay. Now, Chomsky's skepticism, which actually annoyed some people who thought that this evidence was pretty good, but be that as it may, Chomsky's skepticism about the starlings illustrates that it's really tricky to infer recursion from the behavior of another species. It's not really straightforward at all. Okay. Fortunately, there are other species we can look at and other forms of evidence. There are other indications of non-human recursion. Now, evidence for non-human recursion can help us understand what cognitive recursion originally evolved for. In my opinion, there's so much evidence for recursion in the cognition of other species that it probably is there, actually. I'm not so sure about birds. I'm not so sure about the European starling, but when it comes to some other species, I think there probably is something recursive going on. And the really interesting question is, what did recursion originally evolve for? We've already considered Gilbert Harman's argument that language is fundamentally a cognitive adaptation, not an adaptation for communication, but for cognition. And one interesting question is, if recursion is very old in evolutionary terms and predates our uniquely human communication system, what sort of cognition was it for? What kind of thinking was recursion supposed to help out with? Well, a similar question arose with regard to echolocation, right? The use of sound echoes for a number of things, actually. Bats use echolocation to find food, like to find a bug or a butterfly or whatever and eat it. Bats also use echolocation to navigate, and they use it to communicate. So you may wonder, what was echolocation originally for before it was developed as a Franklin, to use Gould's terminology, before it was developed as a Franklin into these other purposes? What was its original purpose? And how can we possibly figure that out? Well, no one really knows for sure what echolocation originally evolved for. However, we do have reason to think that it probably first evolved for navigation. And the reasoning that leads scientists to think that it probably first evolved for navigation gives us some indication of how to determine what recursion in cognition first evolved for. Now, a key concept here is convergence. By considering convergent evolution, we can at least pick up a clue as to what echolocation probably evolved for. Convergence, or convergent evolution, is sameness of structure across species in response to the same evolutionary pressures. Now the picture here, I hope it's obvious, the picture is a bit of a joke. But if there were organisms from another planet and they looked like that, then I dare say it would be a vivid illustration of convergent evolution. But you don't have to go to other planets to find it. You can find lots of convergent evolution here on this planet. Convergence is contrasted with homology. Homology is sameness of structure by reasoning of inheriting that structure from a common ancestor. So here's an example of homology. Humans and chimpanzees both have eyeballs. You knew that. You didn't have to hear it from me. Humans and chimpanzees both have eyeballs. Why? Well, evidently because the human being and the chimpanzee had a common ancestor, and also a last common ancestor, and our last common ancestor had eyeballs, and we inherited our eyeballs from that common ancestor. That's homology. That's not convergence. Convergence is different. Here's an example of convergence. Dolphins have a dorsal fin, and sharks have a dorsal fin. But that's not because they inherited the dorsal fin from a common ancestor. It's because they occupy approximately the same niche in the same sort of environment. That's convergence. So the shark and the dolphin is each faced with the problem of having to move quickly through water, and thus needs a hydrodynamically efficient design. Now, how does convergence help us understand what echolocation originally evolved for? Echolocation is an example of convergent evolution. For example, dolphins and bats both echolocate, but that's not because they share a common ancestor who was echolocating. It's not because they inherited it from a common ancestor. There are many different species who use echolocation independently of each other, and they use it for various things, just as bats use echolocation for feeding, navigation, and communication. But all species known to use echolocation use it for navigation. So it is reasonable as a conjecture that this is why echolocation first evolves. It first evolves for navigation. It later serves as a Franklin for other purposes, such as communication. That's not an airtight argument. It's what they call soft evidence. It's at least the default hypothesis, until we acquire new evidence that might suggest a different hypothesis. Okay? Now, how does this apply to recursion? Most apparent recursion in non-humans occurs in social cognition. Specifically, evidence for non-human recursion involves hierarchical structures formed from the elementary relational models. So let's discuss evidence for the relational models in other species. So what I want to do here is I first want to discuss evidence for at least some of the elementary relational models in other species, and then talk about recursion among the relational models in other species. There are evidently communal sharing relations among male bottlenose dolphins. A male, bottlenose dolphin, a male will often have what is known as an alliance partner. So, alliance partners often dive and swim synchronously. So in Shark Bay, strongly bonded males swim side by side, less than a body length apart, and they surface in precise synchrony. And they also touch. They intermittently touch when they swim together. And the males are also sometimes sexually aroused when they swim together and touch. And these things are a characteristic of communal sharing, or they're one form that communal sharing can take, touching and moving together in rhythmic unison. Alan Page Fisk has noted this, but it's also been noted by Steven Pinker, the Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker, who has also discussed relational models theory. Now here is a quote from Pinker. This quote is from a context in which he's discussing communal sharing. People in groups also engage in synchronized movements like dancing, bowing, standing, sitting, marching, drilling, and exercising. The impression from the outside is of a single communal body rather than many individual ones, and this is due to a law of perception called common fate. Things that move together are seen as attached together. The impression from within is even more insidious. People ordinarily sense the boundaries of their own bodies by observing what moves when they will a part of their body to move. Combine this bit of our sensory motor psychology with a group-wide rhythmic movement, and a person can literally feel as if he is part of one common body. So moving together in unison is associated with communal sharing. You find this in dolphins when they jump up out of the water in synchrony and go back down into the water, dive into the water again, among other things. Now, the core concept in communal sharing is, of course, sharing. And the males in these dolphin alliances, they share females, an arrangement known as a consortship. So Connor notes that the synchronous jumping and diving becomes more common when the males are chasing and mounting and splashing a female consort. Okay. Now, one thing that's especially interesting about the article by Connor that you read is that he discusses recursion among communal sharing in bottlenose dolphins. Here's a quote from an earlier article by Connor and his co-authors, but it's on the same topic. Connor notes that male bottlenose dolphins in Shark Bay exhibit two levels of alliance formation. First, males in either pairs or trios, which are first-order alliances, they cooperate to form coercively maintained consortships with individual females. Okay, so the females are kind of being forced into this. The males seem to be having a lot of fun, actually. To continue, second, teams of two or more alliances, in other words, second-order alliances, cooperate in attempts to take female consorts from other alliances or to defend against such attacks. So the second-order alliance has both an offensive and a defensive function. Now, in the article which you read, Connor notes a third level of alliance formation, in other words, a second recursion. Males from a larger superordinate group also associate together amicably. And that was evidence that was discovered more recently, after the year 2000. Okay. Okay, so we find recursion in dolphin society, but does that mean that there is recursion going on inside the dolphin's head? The complexity of a social structure does not necessarily mean that any dolphin is actually representing that complexity in its mind. Conceivably, each dolphin may be following some very simple set of rules, which has the overall effect of society taking a recursive form. But it turns out that there is evidence of psychological recursion in another species. In other words, specifically psychological experiments were conducted on the Hamadryas baboon. And in this case, we're talking specifically about females. When female, and we're also talking about authority ranking rather than communal sharing, because among female baboons you find hierarchies within a family, within a matriline, and you also find a hierarchy of families, a hierarchy of matrilines. In other words, a recursive use of authority ranking. Now, these authority ranking relations are signaled by threat grunts. Normally, a superior individual will threaten an inferior individual who will cower away and be properly humble. This occurs between individuals within a family, and it also occurs between individuals from different families. In the latter case, the superior family would threaten and intimidate, in other words, talk down to a member from the inferior family. Now, experiments were conducted using hidden speakers with tape recordings of threat grunts and submission signals. And the psychologists, and these were principally Dorothy Cheney and Robert Seyfarth, and also Tor Bergman, these psychologists, they would reverse the threat grunts so that a lower-ranking female would threaten a higher-ranking female, and the higher-ranking female would give the submission signal. What they found was that when you do this kind of funny trick within a family, within a matriline, in other words, if you have a low-ranking individual within a family talking down to a high-ranking individual, that the baboons would not look in the direction of the grunt. They would not turn their head because it didn't interest them very much. It's like no big deal. However, if you have an individual from a lower-ranking family talk down to an individual from a higher-ranking family, and the individual from the latter group gives a submission signal, then the baboon would suddenly turn its head and look. And Bergman, Cheney, and Seyfarth infer from this that the baboon is aware of both a subordinate ranking and a superordinate ranking, and that baboon is aware that the superordinate ranking is the more important one because it has greater social significance and involves a larger number of individuals. And this means that the lower ranking, the subordinate ranking, is viewed as subordinate. In the baboon's mind, it perceives the subordinate ranking as subordinate. In other words, there's something recursive going on inside the mind of the baboon. It's not just a matter of social structure, it's also psychological. And equivalent evidence has also been adduced for Japanese macaques. So more than one primate species has been shown to exhibit psychological recursion. Now, in the case of humans and baboons, it is quite possible that we're seeing homology. From earlier discussion, from reading Alan Page Fisk, that human beings exhibit recursion in their interpersonal cognition. Our social structures, both real social structures and imagined social structures, our social structures exhibit recursion. And this is evidently because of recursion in our minds. And it appears to be similar to recursion in our sentence structure, which maybe that's not a coincidence. Maybe we're using the same computational procedure in our brains to produce sentences as we do to organize complex societies. If baboons and Japanese macaques are also using psychological recursion, this is probably homology. It's probably because we inherited this capacity from a common ancestor, because the evolution between us and the baboons and macaques is Well, it is something. I mean, the evolutionary distance is nothing to sneeze at, but it's much less than between us and the dolphins, and it's close enough that it's probably homologous. Now, in the case of human beings and dolphins, however, it's probably not homology. What you're seeing in that case is probably convergence. And in his article, as you may recall, Connor notes a correlation between social complexity and absolute brain size. And this too is convergence. So primates, elephants, and toothed whales, which includes dolphins, these three groups all have very large brains. And it's not because we share an ancestor with large brains. It's not because we inherited our large brain from a large-brained ancestor. It appears to be convergence, and it correlates with social complexity. And what this suggests is that much of our cognitive ability is an adaptation for social cognition. And I take this to be soft evidence that language as a cognitive adaptation was originally primarily a socially cognitive adaptation. Although this is a point that will be developed over the next couple lectures. It's not something I can completely go into right now. Now, oh yeah, I had just mentioned that there are 3 peaks noted by Connor in brain evolution, at least among mammals. There's the elephants, apes, and the toothed whales. Now, all 3 cases look like convergent evolution because they face similar environmental challenges. Okay? All 3 cases involve open habitat, either on the ground or on the sea. I think that's the next slide. There we go. There's open habitat. Okay, so the ancestral environment for human beings is this savanna, this open habitat. Now, infant vulnerability is extreme in all 3 cases. Elephant infants cannot run quickly or hide very easily. Toothed whales live in an open 3-dimensional habitat in which they can be attacked from any direction. And for humans, vulnerability to attack includes attack from groups belonging to one's own species. These vulnerabilities increase mutual dependence. In an open habitat, seeking assistance from other members of the group for protection becomes more important. Now, Connor talks about the evolution of language in hominins. Hominins just being a fancy way of saying the human lineage, so human beings and the ancestors of human beings. Now, quoting from Connor's article, it's easy to imagine how just one of the abilities bestowed by language, namely communication about others in their absence, might have been put to advantage by those skilled in using and dispensing such information, and also misinformation, to enhance one's social position. In other words, language plays a social function. Of course, one needs to be careful here with the word language. In fact, that was one of the big points that Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch were making. That's why Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch distinguished between at least 2 different senses of the word language. Dolphin-nested alliances are evidence of mental recursion in dolphins, and this recursion may itself be the same operation which humans use in constructing sentences. So in that sense, dolphins may already have language. In other words, they already have the computational core, or something closely analogous to it, the computational core of what humans use in their communication system. You know? But in the case of dolphins, they're not using that computational system for communication. And neither did hominins until our ancestors evolved the sensory-motor interface. In other words, until our ancestors evolved the biological means to externalize the outputs of this computational system. So, what Connor is calling language should perhaps be called externalized language in order to avoid confusion. And you will note that this is precisely the sort of confusion that bothers discussions of the evolution of language. People talk about different things when they use the word language. The sense of language, which means computational operation for generating phrase structure. Now that sense of language may seem awfully esoteric, especially given that people casually use the word language just to mean communication. And they will talk about like the language of dogs, right, or the language of vervet monkeys, the language of flowers. Flowers communicate with bees, right? But the reason for using the word language to refer to this computational system, which is entirely inside the head, the reason for using the word language that way is because our deepest understanding of language in modern linguistics results from attempts to investigate this underlying computational system. So when Connor talks about the evolution of language, one should charitably read him as meaning the evolution of the externalization of language. Now, Connor cites Robin Dunbar as a source. Robin Dunbar is an interesting character who will also pop up next week when we discuss George Miller. Dunbar is an anthropologist, first of all, and he has argued that language, in other words, externalized language, evolved to replace grooming. Now, in primates, grooming communicates information about social status. But grooming is also very time-consuming, especially given that one can only groom one individual at a time. By contrast, speech is more efficient. For that matter, sign language is also more efficient than grooming. It's not clear which evolved first, sign language or speech, but either way, externalized language is a more efficient communication system than is grooming, because externalized language can be used to establish social status for several individuals simultaneously. This would have been important in the hominin lineage because the average size of a gatherer-hunter clan, evidently, was roughly 150 people. And that's much larger than the average group size for other primate species. So, other primate species are living in groups that are small enough that they can spend time grooming as a way of establishing social relations, such as status. However, humans and proto-humans lived in larger groups, and because our ancestors lived in larger groups, we didn't have the leisure, as it were, of doing that. So we needed to evolve something more efficient. So we evolved externalized language. Theoretically, the externalization of a computational capacity that was already in our heads and was being used for something else. Because with language, you can communicate with several people simultaneously, but you can only groom one individual at a time. Now, studies have shown that people spend a large percentage of their time in conversation gossiping. I wonder if that even comes as a surprise. Now, gossiping is a way of transferring information which affects and helps determine social status. which is very similar to the function of primate grooming. And Dunbar hypothesizes that the prime function of externalized language is gossip. In other words, we evolved to talk, or we evolved sign language for the sake of gossiping. Now, going back to Connor. Connor suggests a similar role for vocal communication among dolphins. He notes that dolphin signals divide into two categories. There are whistles and pulses. Pulses have proven difficult to study, but they may express emotion. As for whistles, one type of whistle is the dolphin's signature whistle. So each dolphin has its signature. The signature whistle identifies the dolphin. So it can serve as a contact call when dolphins are out of visual range. So two dolphins can't see each other, but each one starts whistling its characteristic signature whistle, and the other one knows that its friend is nearby. Okay? Now, it so happens, and this was a point that Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch noted in their article, that dolphins are very good at imitating sounds. And human beings are also very good at imitating sounds. And the human ability to imitate sounds is crucial to our ability to acquire a lexicon being like a mental dictionary. Roughly speaking, it's your vocabulary, right? So the ability to imitate sounds is crucial to the human lexicon. Surprisingly, I think it is rather surprising, non-human primates are not very good at imitating sounds. And this is one respect in which the dolphin and the human are far more similar than the chimpanzee and the human. Dolphins and humans are the only known species which can imitate in more than one modality, specifically both visually and orally. So we can imitate motions and also imitate noises. In humans, this allows us to switch from one modality to another if necessary. So, for example, a deaf person can communicate with sign language. We're not limited to communicating with sounds. We can also communicate visually. Now, dolphins have these really sophisticated imitative abilities. Given their imitative abilities, Connor suggests that dolphins may be able to engage in something similar to gossip. A dolphin can imitate another dolphin's signature whistle, and then the dolphin can use whistles and pulses to communicate something emotional about that other dolphin. This is speculative, of course, but Connor is saying it, and he's a dolphin guy. He knows lots about dolphins, so I guess it's at least a serious possibility. It would also suggest convergent evolution, if that's true, that the evolution of language in dolphins, both internal language and even external language, is strikingly analogous to the evolution of language in human beings, both internal, as a computational system in our brain, and also externally as a communication system. Concerning dolphins, there is evidence that as an alliance develops, members of the alliance will sometimes imitate a whistle that's characteristic of the alliance. In other words, the alliance has a kind of badge. So members of an alliance will get together and they will start imitating this alliance whistle as a way of signaling their unity. It's a bit like a greeting indicating membership. Now, in fact, this signature whistle is an example of what Alan Fiske calls a prio, as you should recall. The elementary relational models are evidently innate. However, the standards and conventions for implementing them are learned. Communal sharing is innate, but emitting the signature whistle is learned. The whistle signifies that this is our communal sharing relationship. There's also some evidence that dolphins call one another by name, although Connor is quick to note that this evidence is, as he says, suggestive but remains inconclusive. Now, if dolphins have an internal recursive system for representing complex social relations, and they use signals for gossip, this may suggest convergent evolution with humans. It also suggests what recursion originally evolved for. It evolved for structuring and organizing social information. And it's interesting that even as we use recursion in communication, its fundamental use, its initial and primary purpose, remains social. Now, for next week, please read Herbert Simon's article, The Architecture of Complexity. A really fascinating article about how useful recursion is, and the usefulness of recursion goes way beyond psychology. All right, until next week, I'll see you later. Bye.